Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Snoo here. This is a two-part video series, part 2. First, it was over the damage layers, and that is a separate video. In case you missed it, you can check it out. It's in the description of this video. This one is on the defensive layers for the endgame cast on crit poison, detonate dead, assassin bow build. So it is a bow build. It can only be so tanky, and you guys know me. I'm no stranger to making bow builds, beginning, middle, and end. They always have a certain amount of tankiness. Usually a headhunter is involved to help cover any missing amount of survivability, but this time is different. Okay, we're playing a poison build using mage blood, and so I definitely had to incorporate a fair bit of defensive layers into this build. I'm not talking about recovery layers, I'm not talking about avoidance, I'm talking about true real defenses, damage reduction. There's actually a lot going on here, so I'm excited to share with you what I was able to achieve. And we're going to break it all down. We're going to look at every single damage layer. We're going to spend a lot of time in Path of Building. But here's a sense of what the playstyle is like. You can see that I have to kind of run through enemies before they die because there's a lot of delayed damage going on. And it works really well for bossing because it wouldn't make much difference there. I can actually survive some avoidable or unavoidable boss damage, especially on a boss like, say, 100% Delirious Abomination boss, which I've been handling quite well quite frequently this league. It's been one of my favorite strategies. Just made a video on it, making a lot of currency doing that. And so this build is very well suited for a wide variety of content, and I definitely feel like it's a little bit less niche than most bow builds that I'm doing and more kind of a all-arounder. Here is the Path of Building, and so we still have the same setup as last time. In part 1, I introduced a new variant of the build, including a mage blood swap, and there's a lot of good gear going on here. This is kind of optimized. No mirror tier items specifically. Definitely north of around 500 divines investment in the current snapshot of the economy. There's a lot of skill gems in play. It's a complicated build. It's cast on crit. It's poison. As far as understanding the build and how it works, you can check out the last video, or especially the build guide video that explains more on that. Here's the calculation tabs. We'll be looking quite a bit at the life, armor, resistance sections. We're going to have to spend a little time talking about a few other things that aren't represented in Path of Building, but I have everything loaded up here in the config. Enemies are hindered, covered in ash. I have adrenaline, some extra defense there. I'm in sand stance with flesh and stone. And so everything is set up nicely for a typical combat situation. And yeah, let's get started with number 1. The first thing to discuss is guard skills. Now, these are the most conditional defensive layers, a very powerful defensive layer, very useful, especially in maps, but it's not something you can necessarily depend on a lot. However, this league, we really need to discuss it because we have the new league mechanic, which introduced a specific graft called the Molten Xophgraft, a big favorite among a lot of players. Whether they take advantage of the fire theme or not, this effectively gives you a major steel skin buff. And if you read through here, you can see it'll take a lot of damage before applying to you. If you lose any amount of life whatsoever, this thing gets triggered. But here's the issue. It has a 20-second internal cooldown. Now, you might think that's fine, you know, even if it's 20 seconds and the cooldown doesn't work while it's active, which is the case because it functions very much like a guard skill. It actually functions so much like a guard skill that it shares a cooldown with all of them. In fact, it not only shares a cooldown with your guard skills, every single guard skill is rendered useless while this massive 20-second cooldown is going on. To be fair, you can reduce the cooldown through explicit modifiers by up to, I think, 35%, but that still puts it way outside the realm of what a typical guard skill cooldown looks like. Like a Mortal Call, I think is 2 seconds. Molten Shell, I think is 3 seconds. And so I'm kind of, you know, weighing my options about which one of those two I want to use. Right now, using Molten Shell, as you can see, I got 79,000 armor, and that makes a lot of sense. And then we have Val Molten Shell as well. And so that's what I've elected to do. So again, for certain kinds of build, maybe that graph makes a lot of sense, especially if you can take advantage of, say, the % increased fire damage like I was able to, and you're not looking to get a bunch of extra defense somewhere else, and or if you are socket starved, okay, that would be a convenient place to do it, or if you're not that interested in a guard skill period, and you just want a little bit of extra damage reduction, that's fine. I like having guard skills. I can tell they functionally give a lot of defense for a build, and so that's number 1 on the list, and that's why I'm no longer using that graft. Now, this graft is extremely useful on the defensive side. I mean, you can see automatically it's coming with some physical damage reduction and % max life. There's a lot more going on than just that. Whenever it's activated, it activates if you reach low life, in which case it gives you an endurance charge for free. It gives you a big % more recovery modifier, which makes a lot of sense there. And it has various other explicit mods, one which is super useful for me global percent leech, not just for attacks, but also for detonate dead, which is my primary source of leech, and a source that's hard to leech from. So I've had to really work in the build trying to get the recovery issues fixed. We'll talk about recovery a little bit more later on in the video, but I really like the change here, changing from Molten Xophgraft to Hardening Uulgraft while keeping the guard skill was a very good decision. Notice a dramatic increase in survivability immediately from that, especially on the recovery front. So because guard skills are so conditional, for the sake of looking at PoE, I know this is kind of a popular thing to do, we're going to deactivate Molten Shell to give a more accurate picture of what your real defensives look like. And so you can see the Fizz, Elemental, Chaos, Max Hit, they're lining up nicely. 46,000. Guys, keep in mind, I'm usually rocking around 5 to 10k max Fizz hit on a given bow build at any gearing threshold. And so this is, again, around 5 times more than what I normally have. And as we go back to the item tab, you'll see we got a lovely Progenesis in here. You guys know about this one. A very expensive purchase, usually takes place towards the end before getting mirror tier gear, but a significant boost to defenses for sure. At least 25% damage reduction effectively if you have your recovery in check anyway. And then it's locked in with Mage Blood and then 4 Magic Flask. Progenesis has at least 2 uses, so even on bosses, it's going to be up full time. Unlike the guard skill, a very dependable defensive layer there. But even if we take it off, you'll see that the physical damage max hit is still 40k. Chaos goes down way hard because we're using Progenesis to help cap off Chaos Res. That seems totally reasonable to me. And so yeah, Progenesis, massive defensive layer for sure. So that kind of gets out of the way some of the major items that give bonuses, whether we're talking about the grafts or the flasks. Let's go over some of the more meat of those defensive layers. We're going to start with maximum life. The real nice thing about the max life portion is that the whole story is told right here in the calculation tab in basically 2 links. This one and this one. We have flat life, which every single source of flat life is here. Of course, we have a level. I'm actually level 99, so I have about 100 life more than what's said here. And then we got 5 rare items. They all have tier 1 rolls, presumably, and I can't really fit any more on my items than that because I'm using several uniques, of course. Strength, a little bit of strength, and then we also have journey tattoos, as well as a small cluster, a little number there. What about the journey tattoos? This is different than normal. And so somewhat recently, it occurred to me that because of the general layout of the passive tree, I was pathing very close to 3 different 30 strength notables. And so with a grand total of 5 passive points used, I was able to hit 3 of them, which gave a lot of extra life when allocated with Journey Tattoo of the Body. It used to be really expensive, not terribly expensive now, a few divines each. And you can see that this is giving me effectively around 450 max life, which isn't bad. Now, that's 5 passive points. Maybe it's worth spending 5 passive points on that or not. You know, it depends on you. At the very moment, with the kind of content I'm doing, I'm not allocating these. But I really like the fact that they exist and that option is there. And depending on how you're setting up the build and what you're going for, whether you're prioritizing damage or defense a little bit more, that's a really great source of extra life. And so every source of percent increase is right here. We got a couple of items, including the Watcher's Eye and the Uulgraft, which we already looked at. And then everything else is on the tree. So by the numbers, very typical there. A total of 105% increase, nothing too strange. And that allows me to have a grand total of, at least if I make it level 100, 4,725 life. That's at least 1,000 life more than what I usually have on a bow build at this level. Okay, another layer which we can't forget, often overlooked, resistances. People take it for granted that resistances are capped, but, you know, it requires a little bit of work to do that. It was a lot harder to cap resistances on the earlier portion of the guide, but it's much easier when you have a Mage Blood because you can just use a Bismuth Flask and get 68 all res. And so yeah, it's nice to have fully capped resistances. You'll notice I'm way over capped for cold and lightning resistance. Why is that? Well, usually I don't do this. Even when I'm farming in-game content, even when I'm taking the Eldritch player downside of up to minus 60 cold and lightning resistance, because I have a Headhunter, and typically at that point you're stealing Headhunter buffs, you probably have a huge resistance mod and or resistance shrine either way. In this case, running Mage Blood, I can't rely on that very much, and so I really do need to go above and beyond, capping cold and lightning to help cover that difference. I'm not over 60 res cap, but close to it right here. And so this is a nice, comfortable amount. If I have elemental weakness on me, it doesn't do anything. I'm immune to curses effectively. If I have minus max res as a map modifier, it doesn't mean anything in the context of capping your resistances. And so this works pretty well, I think. All right, let's talk about a much more interesting defensive layer, and one that I never employ. This is literally the first time that I have scaled armor in any meaningful way on a build. And so you can see when we look at the not evasion, see even my mind immediately goes to evasion because that's what I'm prioritizing. Let's go to armor. Well, I suppose it's kind of good that I showed this. So I'm using hybrid evasion and armor pieces, all 4 of them: body, helmet, gloves, boots. I'm not even using spell suppress mastery either, which is kind of interesting. But you can see I'm getting a huge amount from the body armor. Okay, the biggest, most beefy evasion armor, body armor, and I am prioritizing those rolls for a grand total of 3,000 plus of each. And then we get a little bit on the helmet and then a tiny bit on the gloves and boots there. So that's basically it as far as the major armor pieces. You can see that I'm getting a little bit extra here as a veiled modifier on the quiver, as well as, of course, a mage blood alchemist granite flask of the armadillo. That's an enormous amount. Watcher's eye modifier is giving quite a bit, as well as determination. And then we have percent increase. Okay, normally a build like this, you would think I'm not getting much percent increase, right? Because I'm spending so much time on the right-hand side of the tree. But in fact, I do get quite a bit just from a double wheel here in the armor and evasion mastery. A lot of evasion and mastery here, as well as through the actual mastery point. One more quick thing I think I want to mention is Iron Reflexes is only 4 points away, and that removes all of your evasion. So you can see we haven't talked about evasion, but I have 70% evasion. That goes out the window. And even right now, that takes me from about 80 to 120k armor. I don't really know the meaningful difference on that. I know it's 70 to 80k armor feels like compared to 0. It's kind of nice, actually. But the funny thing is you can go way beyond this. You can actually double this number by, for example, running also a Jade Flask as well as Grace on top of Determination. Okay, we'd have to make some pretty big sacrifices to build to start doing that. But at least just for 4 points, dunking all evasion for even more armor. I don't know if that's worth it. Probably not. I haven't really messed around with it. But I just thought it was interesting how much armor could get on the build, up to around 240k. Next up on the list is damage reduction. Okay, so this is a very important defensive layer. Real quick, there's 4 endurance charges. Where are 4 endurance charges coming from? That's from Lionized Paws, +1 max endurance charge. Very easy to get that. That's one of the reasons why I like to use common high-tier uniques, because you can get basically whatever corruption or even double corruption that you want. I happen to have +1 max endurance charge, 6% increased life, which means I get even more life than what the guide is suggesting. But it's very easy to at least get that 1 corruption. So elemental damage reduction right here. It's kind of important to have that because I have a lot of sources of physical damage reduction, but not a lot of sources of elemental damage reduction outside of resistances. So I like the fact that endurance charges are super reliable, and they're reliable thanks to Enduring Composure, one of the most reliant endurance charge acquisition means there. When you take any damage at all, you're just constantly flooded with endurance charges. Now back to physical damage reduction. You can see the number is pretty high here. Where's this from? Well, it's from endurance charges and adrenaline. So adrenaline is coming from Tanu Ahi. This was the core point of the build. On the guide, I talked about this. Corralitos Flask Life Drain combined with no life on hit and some leech gave this crazy high uptime. Now I am using a little bit of leech, cutting corners, no longer spending extra points for Essence Sap and Wild Hunger, and just going straight into the life and mana on hit. The reason for that is because I'm no longer draining my life, but I'm actually dunking my life in a bigger way, to a certain extent, with this link here, Blast Rain Life Tap, connected to Awaken Greater Multiple Projectiles, is making me lose 154 life whenever I cast Blast Rain, as well as the constant triggering of 84 life lost from Unearth. And so while that's not quite as reliable as a constant drain, leech, the fact that I'm losing that much life in one instance means the life on hit here, that number, doesn't really get in the way. I can even, in some cases, run 2 of these, so I kind of have the build set up this way sometimes. It can smooth things over, especially as far as the mana on hit. That's kind of nice, but, you know, that's just optional. At any rate, adrenaline is still very high uptime, not quite as good as it is in the League starter. Beyond that, we have determination. Determination from the Watcher's Eye. So if we look at the Watcher's Eye mod, you can see that one of the modifiers is up to 8% additional physical damage reduction while affected by determination. That is really good. And keep in mind, guys, these are additive. Okay, these are not multiplicative. So any source of additive physical damage reduction is pretty huge. Next up is Conquest of Armour, and so this is a fractured physical damage reduction mod. So you can see I put a great deal of importance on that. And then the last one is, of course, this nifty Hardening Uulgraft, getting an extra 3. And so if we add all those up, that's what? 26, 34, 42, 45% physical damage reduction. That is up most of the time. That's a lot. So you can see we are in the perfect place in the tree to get 100% spell suppression. I'm not even taking this notable here, Entrench, which, I mean, that just goes to show you it's very easy to get spell suppress cap. Let's go back to the calculation tab and look at it. Here is every source of spell suppression. Most of it is from the tree. We do have one roll on the body armor, but I wouldn't necessarily have to get that roll on body armor. There are other ways I could do it. I mentioned earlier, I'm not even taking the spell suppress mastery. I don't have any points devoted into one of those nodes, but, you know, I could definitely do that. I mean, I had thought about doing this once again, getting this suppress set up here. This would be a lot of extra movement speed, frost blink, cooldown, and the works. But this is the setup that I went with. And this is no conditionals. So this is 100% of the time. Now let's talk about my favorite one on the list, less damage dealt by enemies. Why is this my favorite? Well, part of the reason why I went for this build, especially as a bow build, I mean, part of it was the assassin rework, but especially the reason for choosing bows is Lionized Paws, getting a pseudo 6-link in here, which allowed me to run Hex Touch connected to 3 curses, and maybe get another one in a mark, which is what we did earlier on, or later on, dropping the mark and getting a corruption on a very easy pair of gloves to acquire. Don't get any value out of rage, so an indirect synergy there in running a poison-based build rather than a hit-based build, where I would really want to have rage on hit gloves. Don't need to do it here, so I can easily get a 4th curse, in which case we're combining Enfeeble baseline with Punishment Debilitate. Pair those two up with Flesh and Stone, and that's a lot of damage reduction, all things considered. And Flesh and Stone is more accessible to most bow builds, early game, end game, but not these curses, okay? This whole curse package, that is not typical. Very off meta stuff here. And so it just works really nice, especially, you know, getting huge value for poison build on temp chains and despair as well. And so it's super, super nice synergies all around as far as, you know, slowing the enemies. It's delayed damage. I run through them. That's meaningful. Slowing their action speed, temp chains, making them take extra damage. Getting a lot more value out of despair than a typical bow build would get out of elemental weakness, for example. And then getting a whole bunch of extra damage reduction from other curses. Curses are a huge deal in this build. I'm even taking Steeped in the Profane. Another synergy here is that Detonate Dead would want to normally take Corpse Life Wheel anyway, which happens to be right next to the Curse Effect Wheel. And so just tons of synergies all around. In fact, I've even gone out of my way to give you a prompt. And so to help you better understand how the calculations take place, because they're different. In this game, they can be very confusing. A lot of you are already aware of some of this, but not everyone is aware of how damage reduction calculations take place. In some cases, it's percent more, less, versus reduced, increased, additive, versus multiplicative. It's multiplicative in this case, and you can see that if I'm combining Debilitate, Enfeeble, and Flesh and Stone, then I get a total damage reduction value of, or rather, and I take 64.87% of the damage. So it's a damage reduction of about 35% in total with those 3. If a Mortal Call happens to be on as well, then it's over 50% less damage taken to me in the end. So that basically concludes the most obvious defensive layers, damage taken. Now we're going to get into different categories of things like slows, avoidance, recovery, stuff like that. Let's start with slows. We're going to go back to the curses. Huge slow right here. Temp chains. We already just talked about this. Most of you guys understand that this is a very powerful source of slowing enemies down. Extremely strong for poison, for damage, but also because it's delayed damage, it's nice to have enemies slowed down. But that's not the only source of slow. We also have skitterbots. So normally I can't chill with this build. I'm not doing any real source of cold damage. It's one of the reasons why I use skitterbots. I'm also not doing lightning damage. So it's a pretty sensible aura to use here. I love the defensive side of it, slowing enemies down further. This doesn't make them take more damage from the chill side. It does from the shock side, but not from the chill side. It's just nice to slow them down. And so that is a multiplicative slow there combined with that. We also have hinder. Okay, I mentioned this earlier. Enemies are hindered and they're covered in ash. Where are those coming from? Hinder is coming from Touch of Cruelty. Now you might say, well, you're not using chaos spells, so how are you hindering enemies? I could be doing it through a tattoo, but no, not through that. I'm actually doing a more reliable source than that. We're looking at the amulet aspect of the spider. And so this is a sort of global AoE hinder that goes out and makes enemies take more damage, but also it slows them down even further. 30% slow. And then covered in ash is coming from the graft. Okay, Flame Collar Xophgraft actually covers enemies in ash, which makes them take extra fire damage, which is good for the sake of not really damage, but recovery, not leech, but also slowing enemies down by 20%. And I have yet another prompt for you so you can see how the breakdown on this works here. If a boss is cursed with temp chains for 19% less action speed, which is what I have, chilled for 12% less, and then you combine those multipliers with the additive numbers here, covered in ash, which indeed is additive with hinder, but you don't, like there are many sources that don't combine, like hinder and maim don't combine. They're under the same category, but like covered in ash and hindered are in different categories, and so they can be combined to 50%. What is a grand total of movement speed reduction? You can see right here, the boss's final movement speed is 35.64%, and it's even more severe for normal and magic monsters. And so it's really nice to slow enemies down that much on a build that has no cold damage. It's one thing I lament a little bit about this build is the fact that we don't have any freeze or chill for that matter. And so this is one reason why I went out of my way to get that, feel good sensation of going through a map and enemies just seem to be locked down. They're not really doing that much anyway. And this is super strong even on bosses. In some cases, like for example, a 1000 divination card, Pilfered Mausoleum boss is not very threatening so long as he can't catch you. And it's really hard for him to catch you when he's moving at 35% movement speed. Evasion and damage avoidance. So here's the evasion, sources of evasion. We have all the global base number here. We got a little bit on the quiver, a little bit on the items, a little bit of increase on the tree, same as with armor really. And so not a lot to be said there, not running a jade flask or anything. It's nice the amount of evasion I have is, if you can get around 10,000 evasion, you get a nice number out of it. The scaling works so that you don't really get any value out of evasion for just a very small amount, but if you ramp it up enough, you get a huge evasion chance out of it. And then it tapers off pretty severe as you get much higher than this. 70% is a really good number, so you don't have to invest too hard to hit that number. And that is mostly coming from the body armor. Damage avoidance is, well, a couple of things actually. We have elusive. Okay, so elusive is super reliable on the assassin over here. We got a very long lasting elusive. And we're also running the Pantheon, which reminds me, I forgot about a couple of other sources of damage reduction, didn't I? 10% chance to avoid projectiles is additive with the other one. The Pantheon Lunaris is doing more than just that. It's making it so we always avoid projectiles that chain. And then we have less elemental or reduced elemental damage taken if we've been hit recently, which would probably apply in most cases, as well as at least 1% physical damage reduction on a boss. Let's scroll down and look at the elemental ailment avoidance as well as stun avoidance. So I have 100% on all that. I'm not running purity of elements. I don't have any stun avoidance anywhere on gear or on the tree except for tattoos. I'm simply running 10 tattoos with 10% stun avoidance. You could get this on the Mage Blood Flask, but it didn't seem to be worth it in that case. Rather, I combined Storm Shroud with a Bismuth Flask, Suffix, Shock Avoidance. Very typical way for Mage Blood users to get ailment immune. Critical damage taken is a big deal, especially if you're running any kind of Wildwood content. Poison builds get it effectively for free. With enemies poisoned by you, cannot deal critical strikes, but you notice I'm not taking that. I'm rather taking the effective damage increase of poison deal damage faster. Why is that? Well, the assassin already has it baked into the ascendancy, the elusive ascendancy, which makes me move faster, avoid damage, and avoid crit damage bonuses. Almost 100% of the time. We'll see how this works when I start doing wildwood fishing strats. I may have to combine it with the poison mastery, but I think this is probably going to work. Last up on the list is life recovery, and while this doesn't really have much to do with defensive layers, it's an integral part of the build, and actually the thing that has challenged me the most about the build. Damage has been easy to deal with, defenses have been easy to deal with, recovery has been the hard thing to deal with. Let's look at the leech numbers here first of all. You can see that Detonate Dead of chaining leech number is only about half the cap, and that's with me going out of my way to do what I can on that. I got Doriani's Lesson here. This is the only source of global leech not only applied to attacks that I have, at least as far as the guide is concerned. I've taken the mastery for percent increased total recovery of life per second for life, mana, energy shield leech. That's an unusual mastery to take. Most people are taking instant leech on bow build, and so this is a case where the build really struggles with recovery compared to what a typical elemental hit-based bow build would. You just take leech instant, and you just always instantly leech to full on hits. I can't get that with this build, and it's definitely been the biggest challenge. In some cases, I'm running the second life of mana on hit to get a little bit of extra life on hit. In some cases, I was anointing hematophagy on the amulet right now using True Strike. For a hot second there, I was anointing excess sustenance, which is actually a pretty solid way to, as a workaround for getting a huge amount of life on hit without strangling out the adrenaline proc rate for Tanuahi. We also have another cluster notable rather than Enduring Composure that is called Blacksmith, which gives you extra percent leech. You can run 2 large cluster, elemental clusters, and get Doriani's Lesson in both places, which means you'd have to drop the Chaos Cluster, which means you'd have to use the Medium Cluster for Overwhelming Malice. There's a whole lot of things to juggle here. As you can see, I'm just rambling on about it. It's definitely been the most challenging thing to deal with. It seems like there's almost no cost-effective way to make Detonate Dead of Chaining hit the leech cap. That's basically the issue. And then, you know, you would think, well, you have a lot of attack leech, right? Well, I mean, these Rain of Arrows and Blast Rain, for that matter, are such tiny hits. Where's the leech number on this? Ah, here we go. Life leech rate, 27 out of 920. I mean, that's not really... Yeah, that's not really cutting it. That'll pretty much wrap up the video. That's basically all the defensive layers that I can possibly think of, and more, for the Cast on Crit Poison Detonate Dead Assassin bow build. Let me know what you guys think about all the defenses. Is this truly a tanky bow build, or am I absolutely coping in calling this a tanky bow build? For me, as far as my personal journey, league after league after league, nothing even comes close. I've made champions that are nowhere near as tanky as this assassin build, and people they definitely don't associate assassin or bow build with tankiness, understandably so. But I've gone out of my way to do what I can to make this build viable in some of the hardest content in the game, including Uber bosses, 100% Delirious Abomination bosses. Again, getting the damage and defensive layers really weren't that difficult. It was mostly about the recovery, which I still find to be definitely associated with defensive layers. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think. Are you interested in incorporating some of the defensive layers? Did you learn anything new, maybe about the way it's multiplied or additive? Or was there any sort of secret, tech, a graft perhaps, that you hadn't realized that would really help elevate your build, improving its defensive layers? Let me know in the comments section down below. And with that, we are finished with the video. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.